In the mid-1940s, basketball's popularity ran a distant third behind the older and more established sports of baseball and football. Professional basketball had only caught on in the early 1920s, when neighborhood players began forming barnstorming teams that toured the country playing for money. Many of these early teams, like the cities they came from, were divided strictly along ethnic lines.
Now, you got to understand that all sports were segregated at that time, so basketball was no different than any others. So you would have the Jewish team here, you would have the Irish team here, you would have the black team here. And again, because it was this urban community game, teams would develop in pockets, in neighborhoods. And that's really the origin of basketball.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All righty then. How are you doing, everybody? My name is Tim Hanlon, and of course, this is Good Seats Still Available. Say it loud, say it proud. It's the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. Thanks for coming by. Hope you're doing okay. Hope you're staying safe, being well, and looking forward to spring as I am. Of course, the college hoops tournament's coming up. All kinds of fun stuff. Maybe some slight returns to some levels of normalcy, let's hope, especially when it comes to sports. Our little genre, of course, is that which used to be in pro sports, right? That's defunctness. That's things that no longer exist, things that have been previously domiciled, perhaps even events that sort of came and went, somehow stuck in your collective consciousnesses, he says, in pro sports. And we're all about trying to remember those things and digging deep and maybe unearthing some tidbits along the way. This week is no exception. You may remember about 2 months ago, we had a great conversation around the life and times of Eddie Gottlieb, Mr. Basketball, if you will, the mogul, with our pal Rich Westcott. We are going to go back to Philadelphia for a bit of a story that kind of tangentially and overlaps quite a bit, actually, with the story of Eddie Gottlieb, but is important in its own right and deserves investigation and celebration on its lonesome. And that is the team that we talked about with Rich, that Eddie Gottlieb was instrumental in founding and arguably was a springboard for many, many, many basketball exploits, especially the pro level, the NBA ultimately, but lots of stops in between. And that was a team known as the Philadelphia SPHAs. Yeah, that was their name. It was actually an acronym, SPHA, which stood for at the time, the South Philadelphia Hebrew Association. And as you could get a sense from that clip that you just heard, that was narrated by Harry Smith. He formerly of CBS News and now, I believe, still of NBC, MSNBC News fame for the old and I think still ongoing A&E series called Biography about the Harlem Globetrotters. We'll talk about that in a second while that's important. But you get that little hint there, including a little quote from the late, great sports writer / columnist Frank DeFord about the world of pro basketball, or the earliest days of pro basketball in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s even. This is pre-NBA, friends. You had a few pro leagues kind of, spouting up here and there, the American Basketball League and the Basketball Association of America and some other stuff, the Eastern League, which we'll get into in a couple of episodes to come. Kind of sort of a mix of amateur, pro, semi-pro, industrial league stuff. All of that sort of was in the melting pot of what ultimately became pro hoops that we know today. But as Mr. DeFord hinted at, right, the origins, a lot of the early days origins of the pro game actually were very solidly rooted in, I guess you call them ethnic enclaves, certainly sports organizations centered around those. in Harlem, in various African American neighborhoods, certainly in the Jewish communities, and that's where we find and actually see the beginnings of this interesting Philadelphia SPHAs story. Yeah, it emanated out of I guess you could sort of say it was sort of Jewish social clubs at the time, and again, basketball at the time very ethnically centered. The Celtics, which we know today, of course, were pretty much an Irish sort of enclave, first, second generation Irish folks in the Boston region, sort of domiciling and sort of founding, if you will, that team that sort of emanated and sort of became a dominant force in pro basketball. Well, the SPHAs, perhaps a little less understood or celebrated as, say, the Celtics might have been, or even the Harlem Globetrotters. Again, we'll get to that part of the story in a second. But the SPHAs were the you could make the argument, the engine of basketball in Philadelphia and what an influence that this team had. That's what we're going to get into in this week's conversation with our guest, Doug Stark. He ought to know. He's written, I think, sort of the quintessential story of the SPHAs. It's called The SPHAs, The Life and Times of Basketball's Greatest Jewish Team. While by all accounts, this is absolutely a quote unquote Jewish story, right? Heritage, ethnicity, pride, first generation American stories, immigration, all that stuff, right? But it's also the story of Philadelphia and sports, as we got into a bit with our conversation about Eddie Gottlieb. But on top of that, even, it's a story of the roots of professional basketball in the United States. And as we get into, the SPHAs were absolutely a foundational element from sort of these ethnic, shall we say, tributaries that eventually, through people like Gottlieb and others, sort of manifested itself in what ultimately became in the 50s, the National Basketball Association, and Lord knows what it's become since then, and what we know the NBA to be today. But you could be excused, I guess, for not sort of understanding, I guess, the relative humble and socially oriented and ethnically oriented origins of the NBA that exists today. It seems almost incongruous, right? It doesn't seem like the roots of today's NBA were even can be considered to be that. But it's fascinating. That's why we kind of do what we do here on this show. You young whippersnappers out there, you think you know the NBA and hoops and all that stuff. Well, it really is a fascinating journey to kind of go into how really all this kind of got started. And look, specifically, the SPHAs themselves were directly related to and spawned teams like the Philadelphia Warriors, right, which was the team that not only won a championship or so in Philadelphia, but became, of course, what we know today as the Golden State Warriors. Yeah, there is an absolute direct lineage to the not only from the Golden State down to Philadelphia's Warriors, but frankly, some of the contributive elements to the Philadelphia Warriors came from the SPHAs. We mentioned the Harlem Globetrotters. There is absolutely a direct relationship from the offspring of the SPHAs, or what was left of the SPHAs, in seeding the Harlem Globetrotters, in particular, the Washington Generals, the team that was essentially created not necessarily to lose to the Globetrotters, although that didn't hurt the barnstorming business model for sure, but to compete with on a regular basis with quality play. Red Clots and others part of that mix. But that also is a story, the Globetrotters and that of the Generals, that emanates directly from the SPHAs, if you can believe that. If you fancy yourself as an historian or somebody who's interested in the old American Basketball League and that of Abe Saperstein, obviously the founder of the Globetrotters franchise and the American Basketball League as well, a previous episode that we had with our pal Murray Nelson. The EBL, the Eastern Basketball League, and Eddie Gottlieb. All of these stories actually have roots in the story of the Philadelphia SPHAs. And we're going to get into that with Doug Stark, that is, in our conversation this week. It's enlightening. I learned a tremendous amount. And again, you think you know everything there is to know about pro sports, the teams that you follow and that kind of stuff, the leagues. I had no idea. And I fancy myself as actually being fairly, knowledgeable about these kinds of things and going out of my way to learn. And this is an episode that I think you will absolutely not only enjoy, but you will learn a ton, and it will reorient your what you think is your knowledge of the pro game of hoops in the States. Coming up, our conversation with Doug Stark in mere moments. Our sponsor this week, I think, is a perfect place for you to explore some of the history of all of those entities and more. And that's sportshistorycollectibles.com. Yeah, that's our pal, Dean Mitchell. Jealously, we look his way since he lives in the beautiful San Diego metropolitan area. Who wouldn't want to live there? Especially as spring seems to kind of not want to happen fast enough around here in the Chicago metro area. But sportshistorycollectibles.com, like the name implies, it's a fascinating treasure trove of great stuff. Dean and his pals get a lot of stuff on consignment. He finds stuff from garage sales, estate sales and stuff. This is high quality stuff that you're not necessarily going to find on eBay, and frankly is more verified as higher quality. And he does a tremendous job, Dean does, to photograph all this stuff. So you truly have a good sense of what you're going to be getting. And the stuff is just fantastic. And there's a great specialty in teams and leagues and events in pro sports that for whatever reasons are no longer with us. And there's just a tremendous volume of things. And there's new stuff just about every week coming in there. And of course, a promo code for our listeners can be had by using the code GOODSEATS. You can enjoy, please, with our compliments, 15% off all of the great things that you're likely to stumble across, love, and hopefully purchase at sportshistorycollectibles.com. Again, promo code GOODSEATS for 15% off all of your purchases. Thank you to Dean, and we appreciate you checking him out. We get a little referral love when hopefully you purchase a little something there. We appreciate that too. And let's move on, shall we? Here comes our conversation, a wonderful one. One I learned a ton. I think you will too. I think you'll enjoy it thoroughly. Here it is. Doug Stark, let's talk Philadelphia SPHAs pro basketball. As always, please enjoy.
So I grew up in Holyoke, Massachusetts, which is the western part of the state, and it's the town just north of Springfield. And Springfield, Massachusetts is where the game of basketball was invented in December of 1891. And growing up, I played a lot of sports in the neighborhood, and basketball was the one that I played the most. And early on, probably in my junior high school years and then high school years, we got a membership to the Basketball Hall of Fame. And so we went, quite often. And my parents would sort of drop us off, and we could just go run around, look at things, maybe buy a trinket in the gift shop. And at that time, the Basketball Hall of Fame did a number of other events. So there might be autograph sessions, with current players at the time, like Danny Ainge, who played with the Celtics at the time, did an autograph session. They had NBA Day in Springfield, which was the last preseason game every year. And the last preseason game always featured, at least for a while, the defending NBA champs. So it was NBA Day in Springfield, and during the day there would be a luncheon downtown in Springfield with the two teams and people who paid quite a bit to sit with them. And then they would open the doors after lunch, and anybody could sort of run in for 20 minutes and go to the different tables and get autographs of the players, which I did a few times. And I can remember it was the only time when I was in school that my parents, actually my mother sort of wrote me a note that I could get out of school for the day because I would go. And in the evening, they would have the game. So, in 1983, after the Sixers won, they played that year in Springfield against the San Antonio Spurs. So it was seeing, George Gervin and Artis Gilmore play against Moses Malone and Dr. J. And so I was always a basketball fan. And then, I went to college and I went to graduate school, and my focus was on history. And, I knew that I liked history, but I wasn't very interested in teaching in a classroom. And in graduate school, I found museum studies as a program for careers, sort of public history, museums, archives, cultural institutions. So I began pursuing that, and I had a number of odd jobs through the years for a couple years after graduation. And then in my first full-time job came in January of 1998, in which the Basketball Hall of Fame was looking for an archivist and a librarian. And so
it's like a kismet, isn't it?
It was. It sort of felt like a dream job at the time. So I relocated back home and I took the position. And essentially, I was helping to organize the library collection, photos, videos, and I answered a lot of reference requests. And I helped out with a lot of exhibits that were in the building. And I spent 4 years there. And one day I was walking around the upstairs of the museum, looking at some of the earlier history of the game, pre-1940, some of the uniforms and the photos. And there was one photo on the wall. It wasn't very big, probably less than 8 by 10. And it showed a picture of this Jewish basketball team with the Hebrew letters on it. And it said the Philadelphia SPHAs, something like we're champions in the American Basketball League a number of years or something like that. And so I got interested. I said, this is interesting. I have a lot of general interest in sort of Jewish sports and Jewish athletes in general. And so when I moved on to my next position for a number of years, I started to research them. I started to make this sort of a project on the side, and it took 5 years. But I realized pretty quickly that nothing had been written substantially on this team. There were no books per se. A lot of the players from the 1930s, their heyday had passed away. So it was, it sort of intrigued me because most people would know who follow, let's say, Jewish sports would know who Hank Greenberg is, in the 1930s, and they might know Barney Ross in boxing. But, if I was to say, who's Sheike Godhofer or Inky Lautman or Red Wolf or, Mo Goldman or Harry Litwack, you would get stares that these people don't know who these individuals are. And yet these guys in the 20s and 30s and into the early 40s comprised the greatest Jewish basketball team that was ever constructed.
Well, and so some would argue even in some certain seasons, even the greatest basketball team in their leagues and or in the country, right? Regardless of their composition. And by the way, probably, I think every season, the award-winning team with the best collective group of names, because it's probably the all-star name team in terms of some of the greatest and most memorable names that you'll ever find, I think, on any teams.
There's a lot of nicknames today, the Truth, the Answer, the Big Aristotle, but those guys back then, Inky, Sheike, they had some very good nicknames back in the 20s and 30s. And so, it took a while to research. I had never written a book before, but, I knew how to research in archives, and I knew how to sort of make my way through primary sources and, how to put together a research plan. So at the time, so my next job after basketball is I was working in New Jersey for 6 years, and that gave me more proximity to Philadelphia. So I would start going down to Philadelphia on the weekends, and I would, go to, let's say, public libraries or Temple University archives or the Philadelphia Inquirer, their archives, and I would, get copies of magazine articles or newspapers. There was a Jewish newspaper, the Jewish Exponent, which had written a number of feature articles about the team long by the 70s and 80s and 90s, long after their playing career. And they were good because they had interviewed a lot of these older players. So at least there were some good quotes and some good context for what was going on. But it largely came down to a lot of microfilm and a lot of newspapers, going through the Philadelphia newspapers. And I was able to connect with maybe about 10 or 12 former players, mostly from the 40s. And by this time, these gentlemen were in their 80s. So I interviewed most of them over the phone. I would transcribe their interviews and send it back to them just to make sure it was accurate. And so I had that. And, I went back to the Basketball Hall of Fame to see some of their research files, or if they had any other material or photos. And then I just started writing, it was a really wonderful experience, sort of researching this team and bringing to life these guys who had long been forgotten. By World War II, by the end of World War II, they had sort of receded into traveling with the Harlem Globetrotters and being a team that would sort of lay down as the Globetrotters were the most popular team in the country. But basketball, so the SPHAs, so basketball was invented in 1891 by James Naismith, who was a Canadian who was studying physical education instruction at the International YMCA Training School, which was one of the first schools to offer a program for YMCA physical education directors or secretaries. That school now is Springfield College. And so he was given an assignment by his teacher, Luther Gulick, in December of 1891 to come up with a new indoor game that could be played. And he tried a lot of other options, such as maybe soccer or rugby indoors, or modifying some of the other games of the day. He also looked at calisthenics, the Swedish model, the French model, but nothing really took with this class. And then he sort of spent some time thinking about the nature of games. We don't want people tackling, we don't want people running. And he thought back to a game that he had played as a kid growing up in Canada, Duck on a Rock, in which, you would sort of try to toss your rock onto a larger rock. It was sort of a tossing game. And that's where he got the idea that the goal should be sort of above, as opposed to, like a football goal or a soccer goal, but that you should sort of toss it above. And so he instantaneously at that point sort of figured out basketball. And he wrote these 13 rules, and the next morning he came down and he asked the secretary to type it, and he tacked it on the wall, and he asked the janitor if he had any baskets of any sort, hoops, and really all he had was these old peach baskets. And so he took them and he hung them up on the either side of the running track inside the gymnasium, the YMCA gymnasium in Springfield. And at the time, they happened to be 10 feet off the ground, which is why today baskets are 10 feet off the ground. And the class came in and he said, look, this is the last time I'm going to try something. So if it doesn't take, you guys are sort of on your own. And it took. and the class loved it. And the final score of that first game was 1-0. And that was on December 21st, 1891, the first game of basketball. And immediately thereafter, the campus shut down for winter break. And a lot of the kids in the class, the students, took the games back with them over the break to their hometowns. And the YMCAs took an interest in it. And that's how quickly the game spread, was really through the YMCAs. So you have this game which is spreading really quickly. It's popular. It's an indoor activity. And all through the 1890s, there are, a lot of colleges and YMCAs and YMHAs that are playing it. By the turn of the century, you start to have some professional leagues form. The first one was the National Basketball League, which was in 1898, and that was in Philadelphia and New Jersey and Trenton. And sort of that corridor of Trenton and Philadelphia was really the beginning of professional basketball. And there were a lot of early leagues over the next 25 years that had teams in and around those two cities. And so
Philly became almost by its geographical nature, almost a cradle, if you will.
It did. For professional basketball, it did. College was really New York City, but Philadelphia for basketball, for sure, for professional basketball. So while this game was getting popular, it also coincided with Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe. They were escaping a lot of pogroms and persecution and anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe, and they started to settle in northeast cities, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, Baltimore, these cities sort of in the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic. And they would live in tenement houses in urban areas. And the parents worked very hard. They usually would speak Yiddish at home. The fathers would work all day. The mothers would tend to the home with many kids. They might take in extra sewing jobs or laundry. But it was a hard life, and they were trying to make it in America. And their kids, some of whom were born overseas and some of whom were born in the United States, were looking for a way to become more American. Which is really not atypical of other immigrant groups. And sports was one of the easiest ways to do that, where you could become American. And, in urban areas, baseball fields were few and far between. There just wasn't enough space. So basketball became the sport that was attractive to these young Jewish kids. You didn't need much. You just needed rags that you could roll up in tape or newspaper that you could roll up into a ball. You might tack some peach basket or some sort of a basket to a pole. You might also want to shoot it into a different rung on a ladder or a fire escape. So in that respect, it was easy, it was inexpensive, and you had lots of kids playing. And so that is how those two, basketball and the Jewish population around the turn of the century started to merge into this. And there was also settlement houses, the 92nd Street Y, the Young Men Hebrew associations that helped to foster basketball and physical activity and ways that this new generation can become more American. And so that's how the game spread. And so going to the SPHAs, going back to this team, in the 19-teens around World War I, there was one of the high schools, South Philadelphia High School, had a very good team, and a number of these players wanted to continue playing after graduating from high school. So this was the end of World War I, around 1918, 1919. And Eddie Gottlieb, who becomes central to this story, and his two friends, Huey Black and Chicky Passon, go to the YMHA is willing to sponsor them. They do it for a year. After that, there's another sort of social organization called the South Philadelphia Hebrew Association, which was located at 4th and Reed Street. And they agreed to sponsor the team in exchange for uniforms and some publicity. So they played, a handful of games. They played in some of these early, American basketball leagues or American leagues of Philadelphia basketball. And after a couple years, the team was sort of on its own. The sponsorship of the team by the SPHA organization ended. But the players wanted to keep the name of this team, which would always sort of identify them with their roots and the beginning of the team. So at that time in the 1920s, there was a lot of early professional leagues forming, again, in around the Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York area. And Eddie Gottlieb was really
a bunch of those were largely coming out of companies, right? Like sort of like as sidelights to keep various employees sort of happy and energized and competitive, sort of like an industrial kind of thematic to it.
It is. It is. Some of the teams were companies that, would sponsor them for a little publicity, and there was a bigger movement sort of more in the Midwest or in the Rust Belt where companies would sponsor teams, sort of industrial league. But yeah, there was a wide range of teams and how they were assembled and who sponsored them in the 1920s. It was very much sort of the Wild West of professional basketball. Some of these leagues came and went quickly. Some teams could not finish a season. Players didn't have exclusive contracts to any one team, so they might moonlight in other leagues under aliases. It was very sort of chaotic for a number of years.
I'm guessing some kind of improvisation to scheduling too, if there was a league per se. And
the scheduling. Scheduling was difficult because a lot of these players could not make a living playing basketball full time as they can today. So they had other jobs. Games might be on the weekends. They might be in the evenings. Sometimes they wouldn't have enough players. They might have to, hire somebody, a couple of kids in the stands to play, or some local hires to help fill out rosters at certain time. So it was definitely a challenge. It's not like having 15 players on an NBA team today. It was much, much different. But the SPHAs, continued to make a name for themselves. The big professional league in the mid-20s was the American Basketball League, and they played 1 year or 2 years as the Philadelphia Warriors, but then they went back to their SPHAs name. And then they entered in the late 20s a league called the Eastern Basketball League, and they spent 4 years there, and they won a couple of championships there, and that's when they really started to take off a little bit more. Eddie Gottlieb was able to sort of solidify a little bit the roster, and then the Depression hit. It's 1933. And they want to reform the American Basketball League, which had been dormant for a couple of years at the onset of the Great Depression. And so the SPHAs...
That original ABL was kind of really, I think, if I'm mistaken, I have to look back at my trove of Robert Peterson books, but it was kind of like the first earnest attempt at a kind of a real pro league per se, right? As we kind of know it today, right? I mean, the Eastern League was kind of scrappy, and you're mentioning all these other ones that were a little bit more either industrial or, a little looser in formation. But the original ABL seemed to me, prior to the Depression hitting, was kind of like a real solid attempt to kind of solidify things into a professional.
That is correct. The ABL made an earnest effort to be a national league, which at that time, for professional sports purposes, sort of went to Chicago. There wasn't any West Coast, but yes, they tried to have exclusive contracts. They had championships. They hired a commissioner, Joe Carr, for a number of years, who was also instrumental in the NFL at that time. George Halas with the Bears was involved with the Chicago Bruins team. So there was some attempt to create some more structure to it, some more professionalism to how it was administered and run. And by all accounts, it did quite well. And then the Depression hit, which forced it to shut down for a couple of years. But when it resumed, it became a little bit more regional to begin with, more sort of East Coast, Northeast, Mid-Atlantic. But it was really during this period from 1933 to the end of World War II in 1945 where the SPHAs really became the team that everyone remembers and associates with their heyday. And in that 13 years, they had won like 7 championships. As we discussed earlier, not only were they some years just the best team in their league, but in the best team in all of professional basketball. And this is where they made their name for themselves. It also coincides with the Great Depression, the rise of anti-Semitism, and the onset of World War II. And these players would travel around with jerseys that had either the Hebrew lettering or that had it said Philadelphia Hebrews on the jersey. There was a lot of anti-Semitism as they played in small towns in the South and the Midwest. It was very, in some cases, a very hostile environment. It was very similar to other athletes of that period and some of the challenges they faced. But the SPHAs played, their performance really showed that they could fight, stereotypes of racial inferiority, and that Jews were the weaker people or the weaker religion. And they did really quite well. Eddie Gottlieb always every year, sort of between Christmas and the New Year's, that holiday season, always scheduled a Midwestern trip where they would get in his car, and there would be like 7 of them, and they would travel for maybe 2 weeks, through Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, and they would make a big loop, and they would play just every night or every other night games in all of these different cities. And a lot of times they didn't make a lot of money on these trips. And some of the players said, Eddie, what are we doing this for? I mean, it's a lot of traveling. The pay's not great. The environments aren't wonderful. And he says, we're doing this for the future of professional basketball. And so even then, I think Eddie Gottlieb realized how important trips like that were to help popularize and promote the game of basketball.
Well, look, he was, as he's obviously instrumental to this entire story, right? And we're going to do a whole other episode on him specifically, because he in and of itself, incorporating the SPHAs, but beyond that is a hugely intriguing figure. But like basketball, arguably, especially in his later years, was his I wouldn't call it life, with passion and almost to a point of being overly consuming, I guess, to a fault. But I want to get back to sort of the discrimination part in a minute. But I one sort of entree into that. When Gottlieb and friends brought the SPHAs into the ABL for those 2 years, he did something very interesting. He changed the name. Now, I'm guessing some of those sensitivities and or those issues were probably part of that, or am I just projecting onto that by changing the name to the Warriors?
Yeah, I think it might have been a little bit of reflecting some of the sensitivities. I think it maybe had a more general appeal, the Warriors. more of a national league. But after, even though the team was still all Jewish, but after that, he went back to the SPHAs and never deviated from that until the team disbanded in the late 50s.
Yeah, and that itself is, I think, is a statement. I just wonder. Neither of us were there, right? Like, I'm really curious, and maybe it's unanswerable or imponderable at this point. But what went into thinking about changing the name for that first run, and then reverting back to it, arguably with pride and passion and arguably distinctiveness for its for probably a whole bunch of reasons. Once the ABL came back in its new reconstituted form, the name obviously doesn't roll off the tongue per se, right? But it certainly was distinct and unique. But there had to be something there as to like why they changed the name in the first place, and then why they reverted it back. It seems to be like there's some real story behind that. I wish we knew.
No, I would agree. I don't know, but I think he took eventually a lot of pride in the SPHAs and wanted to be associated with them. And I think he never forgot his roots. And I think that was important to him and where he came from. Later in life, he said that he got involved in a lot of things in his life, which he did, boxing and wrestling and Negro League baseball and the NBA. But he says the one thing I loved always was the SPHAs. And that's where he got his start. And I think that was pure passion after World War I and keeping it going during difficult times. And for everything he achieved afterwards, I think the SPHAs really, really was very sentimental to him.
All right, what's this? Blue Chew. All right, Blue Chew is making waves and bringing more confidence to the bedroom, guys. Hey, Blue Chew is a unique online service that delivers the same active ingredients as Viagra and Cialis, but in chewable form and at a fraction of the cost. Blue Chew's tablets combat, he says, all forms of ED and can help men gain extra confidence for when it's time to perform. Blue Chew is an online prescription service, so no visits to the doctor's office, no awkward conversations, and no waiting in line at the pharmacy. And it ships right to your door in a discreet package. The process is simple. Sign up at bluechew.com, consult with one of their licensed medical providers, and once you're approved, you'll receive your prescription within days. The best part? It's all done online. Blue Chew's licensed medical providers work with you to find the right ingredient and strength for your prescription. Don't like swallowing pills? No problems here. Blue Chew's sildenafil and tadalafil, you say that 3 times fast, tablets are chewable. Yes, Blue Chew's tablets are made in the USA and they prepare and ship direct, so it's cheaper than a pharmacy. So, if you could benefit from some extra confidence when it's time to perform, visit bluechew.com for more details and important safety information. And of course, we've got a special deal for our great listeners. Try Blue Chew free. Yeah, free when you use the promo code GOODSEATS at checkout. Just pay $5 shipping. That's Blue Chew. That's BLUECHEW. BlueChew.com. Promo code GOODSEATS to receive your first month free. And of course, we thank Blue Chew for sponsoring this little episode here. And now back to our conversation. Well, explain to me sort of what a typical SPHAs game would be like in Philadelphia, because it was more than just a basketball game, right? It was almost like a cultural event, almost on a weekly or bi-weekly basis.
So the Philadelphia SPHAs played their home games at the Broadwood Hotel, which was located at the corner of Broad and Wood Streets in Philadelphia. Now, basketball in the 20s and 30s, and even into the parts of the 40s, was not really a popular game like baseball or boxing or horse racing or college football at the time. it was still seen as a rough sport, sort of a second-tier sport. Players wore knee pads. It was low scoring. There was lots of fouls. It was sort of brute force. And it didn't always garner as much attention in the press as some of these other sports. So to help promote the sport, a lot of the teams had dancing, bands and dancing that would perform either at halftime or after the game. And this was a way to draw in more interest. And the SPHAs were no different. I mean, Eddie Gottlieb understood an opportunity when it arose. So usually the SPHAs, as an example, would play Saturday night at the Broadwood Hotel. And it would be on the third or fourth floor in the ballroom. So the public would come, and it would always seat about 2,500 to 3,000. It was always largely the same group of people, which is second generation children, men and women, looking for a way to assimilate, meet friends, watch a ball game, have a dance. And so they would come, the men would pay about 65 cents, the women about 35 cents. They would come in, they would grab a program, they would walk up a couple flights of stairs. It would be a very sort of small arena, usually about 65 by 35 feet. There was chairs set up all around on the floor, and then there would be sort of a balcony above that people could sit. And there would be a game, and sometimes at halftime, but usually after the game, there would be a dance. Now, one of the players, Gil Fitch, grew up in Philadelphia, went to Temple University, and loved music, loved to play, and he had a band. And Eddie Gottlieb realized, Gil, how about after the game, you and your band play, and for an extra, an hour, people can dance and have a good time. So after the game, they would sort of run in, change into their tuxedos, come back out, and perform for another 30 to 60 minutes. And this is where the crowd would come, and they would dance, and they would meet future spouses and have a good time, and then go out for a bite to eat before going home. There was a radio show at the time called The Children's Hour, and a young teenager, Kitty Callan, won a contest there. She later went on to great fame with the Jimmy Dorsey Band and had a very long and prosperous singing career. But she got her start singing with Gil Fitch and his band at SPHAs games. And Gil would pick her up and drop her off after the dances because she was underage. She was a teenager. So there would be dancing. And then afterwards they would go out, players would go out for a bite to eat. Now at the time, basketball didn't have, 4 quarters and 2 halves. It could be 2 halves. It could be 3 quarters. There wasn't a sort of codified way of the way the games were played, how many quarters, how many periods, how many halves. It was a little disjointed for a while, but they would play. And the other interesting fact about home games for the SPHAs was that the public address announcer and the person who handled the publicity was a young guy named Dave Zinkoff. And Dave Zinkoff was a Philadelphia native. His father ran a delicatessen. He went to Temple University, and his parents wanted him to become a doctor or a lawyer or an accountant, and he didn't really want to. He wanted to pursue a career in basketball, in sports broadcasting. And he announced some games at Temple. He went down to New Orleans for the first Sugar Bowl in the mid-1930s. He did some boxing and basketball matches on the campus of Temple, and then was always a lifelong friend of Eddie's, and he got his start doing publicity. He would do the halftime promotions and the halftime shows and the announcements. But he also published a 4-page program called the SPHAs Sparks. And the first couple pages would always preview the players or the teams or the upcoming game. It was like a program, a 4-page program. And in it, there was always a sort of a raffle number. You could win a suit. But the last page was the gossip column. And in it, he would give sort of a little bit of a rundown of so-and-so got married, so-and-so had a kid, so-and-so just came back from a trip to the Catskills, so-and-so just graduated college. It was really sort of a gossip column for Philadelphia Jewish community. And these programs were wildly popular. And the hope was that you would come to a game, go to a dance, win the suit, and meet your spouse. And it became a really important way for a younger generation to assimilate in a sort of a non-threatening environment and become very comfortable and become more American by doing so.
Well, and it seems like I referenced Robert Peterson's not by name now, but now I will now. Cages to Jump Shots book. There's a great quote in here by Shikey. You said Shikey Gotthoffer.
Yes,
that's his name. We couldn't go anywhere in Philadelphia without being recognized. It was a very nice feeling. We were very well loved. Even William Penn's statue on top of City Hall used to bow to us when we came by. He laughed. I suspect these the team and these. I'm sure it was a highlight of the social circle, the social calendar for, I guess you could call it the Jewish singles crowd. But I'm wondering if it extended beyond that, like into to other ethnic groups or just to the young kids generally, despite whatever religious affiliation they might be associated with, or was this predominantly that of a Jewish kind of singles vibe to it?
So with the SPHAs, it was largely Jewish singles, largely Philadelphia-based for their home games. But during the 1920s and 30s and into the 40s, there were 3 other teams that were comparable with the Philadelphia SPHAs. One was the New York Renaissance, the Wrens, which played in Harlem, and they were an all-black team. There was the Harlem Globetrotters, which was founded in Chicago, and the original Celtics, which was an Irish team. So what's important is that basketball developed along ethnic lines to begin with. So you had, teams like the Buffalo Germans, the original Celtics, the SPHAs, the Wrens, the Globetrotters. And with the Wrens, they played in the Renaissance Casino on 137th Street in Harlem. And much like the SPHAs, they also had dancing and jazz bands and music as well. And so I think it was for communities and for certain populations to foster a greater sense of acceptance and community. And so the SPHAs weren't the only team that had that. The New York Renaissance was certainly another team that did as well.
Oh, so that's fascinating because it's a huge overlap to ethnicity and or identity, right? While at the same time assimilating or trying to assimilate in a melting pot of America at the time. So that's and you can. So that's, I think that's lost on a whole generation or 2 or 3, frankly, of basketball fans to know sort of that is an essential sort of rooting of this sport from whence it came. And it's just as much a social phenomenon as it is a sporting one at that.
For sure. I mean, it was, I would agree with what you said. It was very important to find a way to be American, to be social, to form a community, to have a sense of identity. And it's much different than it is today. And a lot of this sort of ended with World War II. But before World War II, basketball and these ethnic communities really were important to the development and growth of professional basketball. And teams like the Wrens and the Celtics and the Globetrotters and the SPHAs were very, very instrumental in the development, growth, and expansion of the game of basketball. The Philadelphia SPHAs were able to play in a league. And for a while, certainly the original Celtics did, and they also barnstormed. But the Globetrotters and the Wrens were not allowed to play in a professional league. They were full-time barnstormers. And there wasn't an all-black basketball league for them to join, like the Negro Leagues of baseball. This was, they would play other black teams across the country, or they would play against white teams. And the Wrens and the SPHAs played, hundreds of games against each other over the decades. And they would travel together. Could be upstate New York, could be in Ohio, could be in the Midwest, and they played each other. And those were really important games to the development of basketball. But the Wrens, and the Globetrotters had to do it outside of professional leagues, while the SPHAs had an opportunity to be in a league and also to barnstorm outside of the leagues as a way to make extra money and help promote the game.
Sure, which is right out of the playbook of the Negro League baseball survival schema, right? To supplement but also at the same time, it's also to prove just how good you were against some of the best competition. I mean, even Gottlieb was kind of throwing up little challenges to folks, like even when the ABL was forming, right? He was playing against some of these teams from, say, the Metropolitan League in New York, or it almost as almost like as a challenge to sort of say, hey, you know what, we're just as good, if not better, than you guys are, and that just probably instills even further confidence and pride. And I'm really curious if you could just in your research, who are some of the, shall we say, standout names, not just for their own namesake, because we've mentioned a few of those, but in terms of players that, either kind of stood out in your mind as being, great players or interesting stories, or perhaps maybe just lost to time and or not sort of remembered, sadly, for their prowess. Because this was a team that was just, effectively loaded with talent over the years.
So there are a number of players. I would start with a gentleman, Joel Scheike Godhofer. He was born in the Bronx. He grew up in the Bronx, and he was what we would consider today to be a gym rat. He was also a high school basketball teammate of Hank Greenberg. And Joel played starting in 1933 with the SPHAs through World War II, and he was arguably their best player. He was tough. He was fundamentally sound. He was an all-around good player. He won a couple of Most Valuable Player awards for the American Basketball League. When he retired, he was making $100 a game and was the highest paid player in the league at that time. But growing up, he would go to school in the morning, and underneath his clothes, he would have his basketball gear on, because the minute the bell sounded and he could get out and play basketball, he would take his clothes off and go and play basketball. And he played all the time, morning, noon, and night. He once said that he really didn't even know that girls existed at the time, and really would be what we consider a gym rat. But he was really the best player on that team. There was a gentleman, Harry Litwack. So a number of people might know Harry as being the Basketball Hall of Fame coach for Temple University. He won the 1969 NIT championship and took his team twice to the NCAA Final Four. He coached Hal Greer in college, but he got his start in the mid to late 20s with the SPHAs. And he was a left-handed shooter, sort of a stocky player. And then for 20 years, he was the freshman coach at Temple, and he also served as an assistant with the SPHAs. And from time to time, certainly in the 40s, he was the coach for the SPHAs for a while. But he was a wonderful player. Red Klotz, who most people know as running and owning the Washington Generals, which was one of the teams that traveled and played with the Globetrotters for decades. Red Klotz grew up in South Philadelphia, and his hero growing up, because of the way he played, was Harry Litwack. It was interesting to hear Red Klotz talk about Harry Litwack and the influence he had on his game and what a beautiful left-handed shooter he was. And so Harry would be a name. There was a center named Mo Goldman. He was from Brooklyn. He played at Franklin K. Lane High School and then played at City College of New York under Nat Holman. He joined the team in 1933 and played about a decade with them. And at the time, basketball centers were not expected to score. They were really sort of a one-dimensional player. You know, at the end, for many, many years, after each basket, the teams would go back to center court and have a jump ball. So the center was really about getting the jump and obtaining the possession for your team or getting a rebound. They weren't really expected to score or to provide much assistance on the offensive end. But Mo was one of the centers that started to transition the game away from centers that just were sort of one-dimensional. He could score, he could run. He really sort of challenged what the position could be, the center position could be. And he was very influential for a while in the 30s. There was a gentleman, David Cy Castleman, who was a wonderful outside shooter. And he had good looks and could really shoot the two-handed set shot better than most players. He became a trusted friend of Eddie Gottlieb, and in the 50s and 60s, he tried to help Wilt Chamberlain better perfect or improve upon his foul shooting, which was never the best. So he had an influence certainly long after his time with the SPHAs. There was a gentleman, Alexander P.D. Rosenberg, who joined the SPHAs late in the 1930s. And he joined Eddie on a team, the Philadelphia Warriors, after World War II, which was part of the Basketball Association of America, which eventually led into the what we know as today's NBA. And during World War II, Rosenberg was on the West Coast on a military base and keeping tabs with military basketball. And he found a guy that he recommended for Eddie to sign, which was Joe Fulks, Jumping Joe Fulks out of Murray State in Kentucky. And Jumping Joe starred with the Philadelphia Warriors for the first couple years after World War II and became one of the most offensive-minded players and really started to average 20 or 25 points a night, which was a big deal. And then there was a lot more scoring. So P.D. Rosenberg had a big influence on Eddie in the game in discovering Jumping Joe Fulks. There were players like Red Rosen and Gil Fitch who were part of the Philadelphia contingent, the Temple University contingent, who were quite good and effective during the 1930s. In the 1940s, you had a gentleman, Jack Dutch Garfinkel out of New York, who played at St. John's. Most people would know the sort of the point guard position as being Bob Cousy in the 1950s, but really before him, before Bob Cousy, you had players like Dutch Garfinkel, who could really dribble behind the back and through their legs, and was a little more flashy, and started to challenge the norms of what a point guard could be. And Dutch was really instrumental in making that shift. And obviously Red Klotz, who probably did more than anybody to promote the globalization of basketball for about 6 or 7 decades with the Washington Generals. He grew up in South Philadelphia, played with Villanova University. Before the main event with the SPHAs, there was sort of a junior team called the SPHAs Reserves, and he got his start with the SPHAs Reserves, and then in World War II eventually moved up to the main team and played throughout the rest of his life, and was really instrumental in growing the game globally. So, these are sort of a handful of some of the players whose names have been lost to history, but certainly them. Eddie Gottlieb was really instrumental in professional basketball, the founding of the Basketball Association of America. He was also did the scheduling by pencil and paper by himself, no computers, all for the decades. He ran the Philadelphia Warriors. He had Wilt Chamberlain. He was very involved. Dave Zinkoff after the SPHAs, became an announcer for the Philadelphia Warriors, and then was the announcer from 1963 to 1985 with the Philadelphia 76ers. He had a distinctive way of announcing Julius Erving and Tom Gola Goal, and the Big Dipper. Was very colorful, and was probably the most well-known announcer across the United States for decades. So these are some of the individuals who really made their mark with professional basketball, and whose names, unfortunately, have been lost to history.
Yeah, and look, I encourage our audience to go on to Wikipedia and just look at the roster, because the names themselves, even the ones I love these names. I mean, everybody from Jiggs Downey to James Soup Campbell, Buck Fleming, there's some great Menchie Goldblatt. Can't forget Emmanuel Menchie Goldblatt. I mean, just a great, just fantastic names. And you wonder just the origins of all those too. It have to be stories in and of themselves. You're mentioning, obviously Gottlieb is a central character in all of this. But I guess I want to kind of maybe round third base here in our conversation. With sort of, let's call it the denouement of the SPHAs in Philadelphia, because in 1946 is when one of the two tributaries to what ultimately became the NBA, that being the Basketball Association of America, the other thing being the National Basketball League, caught his eye, shall we say. And obviously all of the stuff that Gottlieb had pioneered, learned, improvised, mastered, whatever, I mean, he was, this was a guy who was, he was coaching the team. He was finding players. He was selling tickets. He was promoting the hell out of the thing. He was counting the gate. I mean, he was, whether he knew it or not, he was basically learning just about everything there was about what, if you will, a professional, not only basketball team, but a professional sports team might need to do and understand in order to be successful. I'm just curious as to, I don't know, like why he obviously left the SPHAs and then sold them. I'm guessing because he saw maybe what was finally going to happen, right? Which maybe he got it in the glint of his eye back when the old ABL got going, was maybe like it was going to really happen this time, that the pro game was really going to set to kind of take the leap and go for it. And he wanted to be part of it. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. So after World War II, the basketball in 1946, the Basketball Association of America was formed. And this league was owners of hockey arenas who wanted more dates in their arenas besides hockey and the Ice Capades. And the Ice Capades were quite popular at the time. So they formed a basketball league. But there was still a rival Midwestern league called the National Basketball League, which was founded in 1937. That league had the better players, but the cities were not always top-tier cities.
Yeah, Fort Wayne, for example. No
Fort
offense.
Wayne, it might be Syracuse, it was, Youngstown. I mean, it was smaller, Sheboygan, Oshkosh. So they had the better players, but the Basketball Association of America had the better arenas and the better cities. So for a number of years, there was sort of a war going on with them. Eventually, in 1949, that league merges to form the National Basketball Association. So in 1946, after the war, they're looking to start this new league. And Eddie Gottlieb is instrumental in that league. There was a team that was going to be in Philadelphia. He hooked on with that. It was called the Philadelphia Warriors, probably as a reflection back onto that team in the American Basketball League in the mid-20s for a couple seasons. And he really had authority to run that team, stock it with his players. So he only took a couple of his former SPHAs players with him. Now, the ABL after World War II became what we would consider today a minor league. It was largely a weekend league again. The cities were maybe Philadelphia, New Britain, Hartford, looking maybe Scranton. They were really smaller cities. So it wasn't an official farm system, but it sort of served as a little bit of a farm system for BAA teams. So by that point, Eddie was less involved with the team. Harry Litwack was running them. And I think by the end of World War II, there was much greater appetite for professional basketball. And part of that was the success of military teams and what was happening during World War II, which helped sort of promote and lay even a greater foundation for professional ball. And I think at that point, Eddie felt, I think this has a more of a chance to make it. The cities are bigger, the reach is greater, the fans, the amount of fans, the money eventually could be better. So, the SPHAs played in the ABL for a couple years after that in the late 40s, but were really not competitive. They were not all Jewish at all. In fact, it was just the name only. And then they became one of the 3 or 4 touring teams with the Harlem Globetrotters. And by that point, they had nothing to do with being Jewish. They were just a team that traveled with the Globetrotters, like the Boston Trojans or the Washington Generals. And they would play against the Globetrotters. And what's interesting is professional basketball in the 50s did not do that well. Not what we consider today. It was not financially sound. So the Globetrotters would play double headers in the arenas with the NBA. And the interesting thing is the NBA would be the first game and the Globetrotters would be the second game. And for years, the Globetrotters kept early professional basketball in the 50s afloat because it wasn't that popular. And then by 1959, the SPHAs officially ended play. They were sort of disbanded, and Gottlieb was getting Wilt Chamberlain for his team in Philadelphia, and the game was changing tremendously. And by then, the SPHAs were sort of a distant memory and really hadn't been competitive like we would know since the end of World War II.
Now, I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but upon selling the team to Red Clots, I think it was in 1950 or so, and then becoming basically, I guess, a full-time, if you will, barnstorming mark, I guess, for the Globetrotters and their touring and whatnot. Did they, or did there, is there some lineage somewhere in there evolve into the Washington Generals themselves? I think there's some lore out there that the SPHAs essentially became what is now known as, or what ultimately became the Washington Generals, or is that just sort of maybe wishful thinking? And
yeah, so there's a myth that the SPHAs became the Generals, as well as Eddie selling the team to Red Klotz. And when I had a chance to visit Red in New Jersey and ask him about it, he unequivocally said that he did not sell the SPHAs to him, and they did not become the Washington Generals. So it's a myth that's been out there, but according to Red Klotz, there is no truth to that.
That's interesting. See, we're breaking some news years after the fact here on this little show. So that's interesting. But it did seem, that does seem, regardless of if there was an ownership change or not, it does seem like the diaspora of what was the SPHAs at that time kind of did get integrated, if you will, into the Globetrotters realm of barnstorming and competition of such. Yeah.
For sure. And Abe Saperstein, who ran the Globetrotters, and Eddie Gottlieb were very, very good friends for decades. And both were involved in promoting Negro League baseball. And so they had a connection outside of professional basketball. And during the 1950s, Dave Zinkoff went on a couple of European tours with Abe to help promote and be their PR person as they went overseas. So there was always a connection between the two, and for many years it served basketball well.
It's fascinating. I mean, and in many respects, you could go to a Globetrotters tour when we can all do that again, and they're playing the Generals. You could actually kind of squint really hard and kind of see some at least a couple of tributaries back. So let me wind up with this question then. And it's one we ask a lot of our guests, especially with teams that have either relocated or gone on to other incarnations and not sort of just died completely. And that is, where in your mind does the legacy of the SPHAs, shall we say, officially reside? And now you're an historian by trade, so this actually may be a real more, meaty question than just, to the average hoi polloi that we normally ask. But I guess the question really is, so if there were to be celebratory things or jerseys or throwbacks or Hall of Fames, adding banners and commemorating and plaques and stuff, is that going to be in Philadelphia somewhere? Should that be with the Warriors in Golden State? Does it rest with the Globetrotters organization because the diaspora of what the SPHAs eventually became sort of wound up there in terms of the barnstorming kind of thing?
I think the SPHAs legacy resides in Philadelphia, and it resides in Jewish Philadelphia. The Broadwood Hotel, where the team played its game, is now actually a parking lot for a hospital. And there is a historical marker out there commemorating that the SPHAs played their games there. There are some Philadelphia Jewish Hall of Fames in which they've been honored. They have been actually nominated for the Basketball Hall of Fame in Springfield. They have not been elected. As I mentioned earlier, those three other seminal teams of the Harlem Globetrotters, New York Renaissance, and the original Celtics, they are all enshrined in the Basketball Hall of Fame as teams. And the SPHAs are a glaring weakness in that they have not been formally inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame. They are peers, certainly equal, and at times they exceeded the other three teams in achievements and accomplishments. And their omission is a glaring omission when you look back at sort of the importance of ethnic teams that help build and spread the popularity of professional basketball sort of pre-World War II. It is my hope that one day they will be formally recognized. There is an exhibit that's part of their newly renovated museum that talks about Jewish basketball. They are incorporated, but they are not seen as being a Hall of Fame team yet. The other is, their style of play was not the traditional sort of plodding style of play of teams in the 20s and 30s and 40s. By the 30s, they had developed a real sort of fast-breaking type of offense, which was very different than what you would see today. The ball would rarely touch the ground. The players would move and pass, and the ball would just go from one player to a next. And it was a wonderful thing to see. It was fast-paced. They were fundamentally sound. The ball didn't touch the ground. There wasn't extra dribbling. There wasn't a lot of isolation or 1-1 play. It was really sort of a team game where the basketball just sort of floated between everybody, looking for the best shot. And I think that style of play is lost on basketball, and I think the team aspect sometimes gets muddied as players get to more sort of isolation and playing hero ball. But I think the SPHAs still have a tremendous legacy. It was when basketball was a Jewish game. Today, Jews might be more owners or general managers or in position or commissioners, things of that nature. But for decades, basketball stood on the shoulder of Jewish players as they really promoted the game and took it out of the urban areas.
Well, and I think this is part of the reason why we do shows like this, because I think it's, as I said earlier, it's lost on a whole generation or two or three, frankly, of folks who consider themselves basketball fans, either the collegiate level or the pro game, especially. I think today's generations, they kind of just think that some of these teams and franchises and rules and all that kind of stuff just magically sort of occurred, right? And they're how these things came to be. I mean, we didn't even scratch the surface about how instrumental people like Eddie Gottlieb were in helping create and bend and shape and evolve rules, right? The scheduling, you mentioned it before. I mean, this is a guy who literally by hand for decades until a computer program in the late 70s, early 80s kind of took over but it was an art and a science that he did by hand, putting that schedule together and all the logistics and stuff. I mean, these are, it's on the backs of these guys and this organization and the play and the socials. I mean, it's all part of the fabric of, if you call yourself a basketball fan, this is part of that fabric. And to me, it's fascinating. And why it's fascinating is because it's completely unknown to me, right? I consider myself as an average sports fan. I mean, basketball is, certainly up there. And I grew up as a long suffering New Jersey Nets fan back in the day when I was growing up. But even that story, right? Playing in the hardwoods of Teaneck, New Jersey, in an armory somewhere in the old ABA. But even on that, that wouldn't have happened without generations before, like you're describing. And I guess the last question would be, what do you think happens? Do you think that this team does ultimately get commemorated in the Basketball Hall of Fame or by the NBA or some other, official sort of coronation, so to speak, from some group that, that matters, before it kind of sadly maybe drifts away? You'd hate to see that.
Yeah, I think eventually they will get inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame. And I think that will be the crowning achievement of recognizing and making sure a team like that is not forgotten. I'm confident one day they will eventually be elected.
If you consider yourself a Golden State Warriors fan, you think you understand the Harlem Globetrotters and their story, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Well, you don't know the half of those and other things without more fully understanding the story of the SPHAs. And to me, it's fascinating. We love going deep on all this stuff because there's so much history behind all this stuff. And again, to sort of just take everything at face value, say in today's NBA, without understanding sort of how the stuff got that way, this is a great case in point. The book you need to get, it's called The SPHAs. And again, that's SPHAS, which was the acronym, The Life and Times of Basketball's Greatest Jewish Team. It's by our guest this week, Doug Stark. It is published by Temple University Press. It is available wherever fine books are found. And of course, you can find a link to it on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode. It's number, what is it now? 207. My goodness, with Doug Stark. And you'll find a convenient link to the book. To Amazon, we'll get a few shekels of referral love. We always love getting a couple of extra dollars and cents to kind of keep our lights on. We appreciate that. While you're there, you can also get Doug's other book, When Basketball Was Jewish, which is more of an interview-oriented setup. Voices of those who played the game, also quintessential to understanding a major tributary in the formation of the pro game here in these little old United States. And just fascinating stuff all around. And I thank Doug for the conversation and the learnings for sure. I thank, of course, my pal Jerry Payne this week, who has put together all the pieces nimbly and in perfect fashion. We appreciate his production skills as always. Jerry Payne, Audio Excellence. And look, if you want to follow our show, by all means, we're on social media. Don't be shy. Find us on Twitter at Good Seats Still. You'll find us on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available. There's a little Facebook page devoted to us. You can send us email if you'd like. Go right ahead. We try to keep up with it, and we owe a lot of people a lot of responses, but keep doing it. We will get to it. We promise. That's hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. Thank you for your proverbial cards and letters. We have a little email newsletter we'd like to send out each week in advance of each week's show. Give you a little head start to your weekly listening. And just find that link on the website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. And what else? I don't think there's anything else. That's it. My condolences to all of your loved ones who have to depart with you and not see you for hours on end as the hoops tournament gets into gear. Don't forget the NIT. That's still happening in some form or fashion. And yeah, the CBI, the College Basketball Invitational, down to 8 teams this year, but it's still alive too. So plenty of college hoops. Hope you don't lose any relationships over the intense amount of time you'll be spending in front of the tube. But I know I'll find it interesting and a bit of a return to normalcy. Let's all hope, shall we? Until then, enjoy the hoops. Enjoy the week, and we'll see you next week, of course, here right back at you. Thanks very much for listening. Take care, everybody.